This episode's all about the self. You know, are you feeling yourself? Oh, no, that may not have sounded the way I meant it to sound. Okay, so the self. In the previous episode, I said I was going to talk about culture. Well, I'm going to talk about culture, the difference between culture and society, in the next episode. I was thinking about putting it into this episode, but I'm going to leave it for the next episode to keep this video short. Okay, so this episode's all about the self, and I'm going to start off by talking about Game of Thrones. You know, I want to crowbar Game of Thrones into this episode.
Winter is coming.
Now, not everyone has seen Game of Thrones, but a lot of people have. It was the most popular TV show ever. Now, if you have seen Game of Thrones, you'll have been presented with, well, at least up to about Series 6 at least, with a glimpse of some really interesting things in relation to the social self. If you haven't seen Game of Thrones, then what's wrong with you? Where have you been? But no, seriously, it's fine. You don't have to watch it. But if you haven't watched it but you want to watch it, I'll try not to put any spoilers into this episode, but there may be some things that will give you a hint as to where the story's going in Game of Thrones, so beware of that.
You know how it ends.
Now, Series 1 to 5 of Game of Thrones really grabbed people's attention. You know, it's arguably changed the way we think of TV dramas. The series was celebrated for having great storytelling and even greater acting, but it was an upsetting series to watch. Now, some of our favourite characters in the show got killed off really early, you know, way too early. And there was no easy split between the good and the bad characters. It was really hard to find someone to hate full-heartedly as well as someone to love full-heartedly.
He's talking about you. What?
You know, these were complex characters who didn't fit easily into that good and evil binary. There were no clear heroes, no clear villains. All of that kind of changed from Series 6 onwards. And as for the last series, don't even talk to me about that. Now, if there's no heroes and villains, if the main characters get killed off early on, and kept getting killed off all the time, now we might expect that sort of a storytelling, or that sort of a story, to be really unsatisfying, you know, in terms of no heroes, no villains.
Disappointing.
Particularly because much of the media we consume is constructed around good and bad characters, heroes and villains. Our nightly news programs also use this narrative, particularly TV programs like Current Affair. Now, not only were the characters in Game of Thrones complex, they were also largely unimportant, and this was signified by how often a character we would think was central to the storyline got killed off.
He's dead.
He's dead.
No, he's dead.
Is he dead yet?
Yet we still stuck with the story. We still kept watching the story. Now, there's something beyond the individual characters here that was drawing us into the story. We were as concerned, or maybe more concerned, for the particular families, you know, the houses, the 7 houses in Game of Thrones. You know, Stark, Arryn, Tully, Baratheon, Lannister, Tyrell. Oh my God, I've wasted my life. From Series 6 onwards, things changed. The books upon which the series was based had run out, and the producers brought in some Hollywood scriptwriters who had a different way to telling stories. They brought back the narrative of the hero and the villain. You know, the characters lost their complexity, but at the same time, the characters grew in their individual importance to the plotline. So things changed quite dramatically. And some people say that this is why, particularly by the final series, people were really disappointed in Game of Thrones. Now, I've put up an interesting little article on this on our Moodle site, and for those of you who can't access the Moodle site, here it is. Now, this little segue into Game of Thrones. Okay, I love Game of Thrones. I can't stop talking about Game of Thrones, but I'm talking about Game of Thrones here because it nicely illustrates the big themes for our unit, specifically tied to understanding the social self. So the first one of these big things is the distinction between collectivism and individualism. The second is the distinction between dialectical thinking and Western logic. Now, I'll pick up on these two issues as we go along, but for now, here are the key questions. Is the self separate from the other? And is the self consistent and stable? Now, I don't want to spoil things, but here are the answers as far as mainstream psychology is largely concerned. Yes, the self is separate from the other, and yes, the self is consistent and stable. Indeed, when it becomes unstable, that's seen as a sign of mental illness. More about that in a later episode. Now, what we have here is a preference for individualism over collectivism and Western logic over dialecticism. Collectivism versus individualism, dialecticism versus Western logic. Now, actually, something quite interesting is at play here, putting this argument in this way, using the verses, collectivism versus individualism, dialecticism versus Western logic. Putting them into these binaries, that's an example actually of Western logic, a preference for binaries over categories that are entangled and contradictory and complex. Complex. I've invented a new word. Complex. That will be in the dictionary soon. So we have these binaries, men versus women, white versus black, disabled versus non-disabled. You're either one thing or the other, and you can't be the two things at the same time. That's not allowed. And if you try to be two things at the same time, then you're seen as a degenerate or a fraud, or maybe a bit psychotic. Now, the other central question we have is, can we truly ever know ourselves, and can other people truly ever know us? Here are those thoughts in a mystical and actually slightly creepy animation. I did that animation. My animations are either creepy or depressing. I don't know what's going on there. I don't want that level of personal self-insight. That worries me. I'm a creepy, depressing man. Anyway, on with the unit. On with the video. So, some fundamental questions here. Can we know ourselves through introspection? Can we be known by others through observation? Is our nature independent and distinct from our environment, or is our behavior reflective of our environment? The old nature-nurture debate. And finally, are we separate autonomous selves, or is the self and the other entwined, kind of co-joined? Now, some big questions that sit behind any and all inquiries into the self. Now, mainstream psychology has provided some answers to these questions, but you largely get these answers through the assumptions that mainstream psychology carries. It doesn't often present you simply with these questions and answers, overtly, in your face. You kind of have to read between the lines in order to find out what the answers to these questions are. And mainstream psychology today would say that no, we can't know ourselves through introspection, but that we can be known to others who are trained psychologists. I can't speak today. Trained psychologists, specifically those who are trained in objective methods of scientific inquiry. One powerful idea in psychology is that we are biased when it comes to understanding our own behavior, but also when we try to understand the behavior of others. And one influential idea is the notion of attribution bias. When we succeed, we attribute it to something about ourselves. When we fail, we tend to attribute that failure to something about the social environment we're in, or we blame it on other people, So when you do well on an assessment, you tend to think that it's because you did well, you're damn brilliant. But when you do badly on an assessment, you tend to think that it's because the assessment was too hard or too stupid. Your tutor's stupid. Actually, you might have a point there. Now you can find a few more examples of the way psychology has found our perceptions of ourselves are biased. This is the material in chapter 2 of our prescribed text, and you'll find some really interesting research being reported there in relation to the biased ways we understand our thoughts, feelings and behaviours, as well as the thoughts, feelings and behaviours of others. Here psychology is positioning itself as the objective observer of human behaviour that is able to bring these biases in our own understandings of ourselves to light. Now, some of this work is really compelling, and you might have found yourself drawn into it when reading chapter 2 of our text. Certainly, psychology has produced some compelling work in this area, in this area of social psychology. Now, psychology on the whole has claimed these achievements of understanding is not through introspection, but through experimental and observational work where psychologists place social distance between themselves and those they study. They become the disinterested neutral observer. The first problem with this is that doesn't mean, even if that were true, that psychologists are objective observers of human behaviour. Even if that were true, that doesn't mean that someone else's interests are not being served by the observations psychology makes. Think about that part in chapter 2, which recounts how people who are paid money for their work do not necessarily work better than those people who aren't paid money for their work. Now, can you think how that idea might serve particular interest groups more than others? How it might advantage some people in society and might disadvantage other people in society?
You don't need slaves to make money.
Now, we're now getting into the topic of psychology's methods of inquiry. I've got another video on that called The 7 Ages of Methods in Psychology, and where you can see how we've come to the point we are presently at in psychology. So that's another one of my videos up on my YouTube channel. So if you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, go do that. Now, in our prescribed text, you do get some material on culture, and here the vehicle to talk about culture is that distinction between individualistic cultures and collectivist cultures. Our concept of self in individualistic cultures is one of an independent, autonomous and self-contained unit. To present ourselves in the best light to the world, we need to show how individual we are, how unique we are. Now, this can be expressed in our clothing or other aspects of our appearance or our personality and so on. Now, in a collectivist culture, the self is not independent from others, but interdependent on others. Your sense of self is very much more tied to the social group you belong to. You have as much or maybe even more of a group identity than you do an individual identity. And individualistic cultures are those found in Australia, the UK and the US. Collectivist cultures are those found in such places as Central and South America and China. But be careful with this binary. In Australia, for example, an individualistic culture is that brought in by white European settlers. We have the longest surviving human culture on the planet in Australia, the culture of indigenous people, which is collectivist. Largely it's a collectivist culture. But even here, it's not that useful to think of things in these binaries. Even among individualistic cultures, you find the expression of collectivist behaviours, such as the strength of the workers' union movements and other social movements that you find in Australia, in the US and the UK, and in other individualistic cultures. So more often, we find no simple way of defining people as collectivist or individualistic. It's best perhaps to think of it in terms of a balance between the two, with some cultures being imbalanced, overemphasizing one over the other. And Australian culture, mainstream white settler Australian culture, overemphasizes the individual. But what we can do is we can often find that a society can be defined as more clearly individualistic or collectivist when you analyse how its social institutions function. Institutions in relation to education, law, banking and finance and so on. Now think about your university experience here. Ever noticed how much you're expected to work as an individual? Even when you undertake group work, you're required to submit individually produced assignments for assessment as part of that unit.
We have proof that you plagiarized your thesis.
How about the issue of plagiarism and the moral panic that we have around student cheating, passing other students' work off as their own? The university is premised on the notion of the autonomous worker. One reflection of this is our rules of plagiarism. Here, knowledge is individually owned, which is why you must follow particular rules around citing and referencing the work of those other people, because they own it. You don't own it. It's their knowledge, not your knowledge. Now, we drill that into you, that thing about referencing and citations. APA, drill it into you. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's an assumption that knowledge is owned by individuals and not by you.
You plagiarized Nelson Mandela.
Now, in a collectivist culture, knowledge is not owned by an individual, but is collectively owned. So the notion of plagiarism is either not there or not so strong. And that's why many Chinese students struggle with our rules around plagiarism and around our expectations about undertaking independent study.
You have to work that out on your own.
Now, where has most of the theory and practice you learn come from? Well, it mostly comes from the US and Europe. But some of it comes from Australia. This is not a conspiracy going on or anything as sinister as that. It's just a reflection of how the US is the dominant world power. They have more economic power, and that translates to academics who have the most time to do research, the most funding to do research, and the most publishing houses through which to publish that research. It's kind of like the US TV programming, They produce more TV than we do in Australia. And it's cheaper for us here in Australia to buy US TV shows than to make our own. So that's why we have so many US shows in our TV schedules.
Some idealized, make-believe version of the American dream.
We consume a lot of our research from the US. A lot of the theory that we learn comes from the US, and the US is a very individualistic culture. Now, that research coming from an individualistic culture is premised on predominantly individualistic conceptualizations of the self as independent and autonomous. And it's more likely premised on Western logic, which splits the world into binaries, us and them, black and white, men and women, and so on.
Logical.
So much of the theory we come across in psychology is built on a concept of the self that's autonomous and largely intolerant of ambiguity and inconsistency. A self that has to be unitary to be healthy.
This is dialectics.
Now, there are cultures that are much more accepting of inconsistencies, where knowledge is built upon a dialectical system for thinking, where contradictions are accepted and adapted to rather than rejected. But in our mainstream culture, we mostly don't tolerate contradictions or uncertainties. Something is either true or false, right or wrong, good or bad.
The poor disgust us because they are us.
Do you start to see the connection here with Game of Thrones? Is it all making some weird sense? There's a method to my madness, Now, right now, my generation are the ones in power, and my generation is the one that was the first generation really to move from the generation we to the generation me. It was my generation that fully embraced individualism. Prior generations to mine in the US, the UK and Australia were individualistic. There's a much stronger sense of collectivism running through people's sense of themselves. It's said that subsequent generations are becoming even more individualistic, self-obsessed and narcissistic. But there are also signs that the generation after the millennials, the next generation, Generation Z, might be showing greater signs of collectivism, largely because of the collective catastrophe that my generation and the baby boomers have left everyone. That we're heading towards catastrophic climate change. Time to finish up. Assessment 2. Do you notice that's about reflection rather than reflection? And that sounds the same. You have to see it written down. So reflection is sort of being self-absorbed, whereas reflection is where you aim to see yourself through the eyes of another. So you see, we're almost getting a little bit collectivist on our unit. Now, when you read through chapter 2 of our prescribed text, this is my other final kind of thought. When you read through chapter 2 of our prescribed text, many of the theories described may feel compelling. Have those moments of, oh yes, that's me. That's so like me. Like kind of reading your horoscopes. If you read horoscopes, it's not proper science, by the way. But when you read your horoscopes, you go, yes, that so describes me. I'm so that star sign. I'm such a Capricorn. Old goat, also known as. You think it describes you. It captures your experience perfectly and your behaviors perfectly. But sometimes we forget that not everyone has that sense. Not everyone thinks, yes, that's me, when they read those theories or come across those psychological theories. It's because it's not them. It's research that's based on people who are not like them at all. So those moments where you're sensing some truth in the theories that you read, maybe it's because it only speaks your kind of truth, because it's based on research made up of your kind of people. That knowledge is culturally specific to your cultural group that happens to be the dominant cultural group. The other thing you might have noticed is how culture is positioned halfway through chapter 2. It's picked up again towards the end of the chapter, but the chapter kind of carries on regardless of the content on culture. That content that kind of critique much of the theory in the text. It's kind of like, it's business as usual. Once we've acknowledged that cultural factors are there, we recognize the cultural factor, but then we kind of carry on as usual in psychology. Nothing else has changed. We don't transform our knowledge in light of that cultural understanding. Now, the trick for us is to acknowledge these big cultural differences in terms of things like dialecticism and collectivism on the one hand, and Western logic and individualism on the other. And once we recognize those differences, to ensure that for mainstream psychology, it is not business as usual, that things are gonna change. Whoa, that's a big thought. Now I think we all need to go for a lie down. Time for a lie down. Now, hopefully you've not stopped feeling yourself. Oh no, I've done it again. Don't report me. I don't want to have to go on another course. Anyway, best stop now before I get myself into more trouble. Culture leads to lots of misunderstandings. There. Think I've got out of that one. So, till next time. Ta-da.